Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Greetings to the town of Brookline. My name is Nick Bates. I am the Assistant Director for Thurman Center Networks in the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground here at Boston University. As well, you all have heard of our intros and you heard a little bit about what our conversation will be tonight. In our three boxes on your screen, you will see Jessica Hamilton, I apologize, and Reverend Andrew Kimble as well. These are two people who are former Jessica's a current School of Theology student, and Andrew is a recent graduate of the School of Theology. We're here today to talk to you a little bit about two icons of the civil rights movement. One is a little bit more known and a more popular than other. And then the other is a little bit more influential to some of the philosophies that you all have seen in the civil rights movement, but you may not know about this person's influence. And so I would be wrong to not give you more information about our namesake here at the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground. So to give you all a little bit of peace, and then we'll get into our conversation. Howard Washington Thurman was the first ever Black dean at a predominantly white institution, first ever Black person to hold the position of dean of a chapel at a predominantly white institution here at Boston University's Marsh Chapel, beginning in 1953 and ending in 1965. As you all know, if you think about the context and the time period, that's a pretty monumental statistic and iconic thing to be able to hold such a position, especially since Boston University is traditionally a Methodist institution. Howard Thurman believed in sort of the unity of all people, as people love to say, but he also believed in this philosophy called common ground, which our center is named after. And I would be remiss to not take some time to clarify what that means to Howard Thurman. Common ground is not a kumbaya, everybody come together, we are one type of thing. For Dr. Thurman, it was a twofold journey. The first was a journey of self-exploration. He would say things such as, how do we go deep inside and listen to the sound of the genuine? And so for him, it was about the individual taking time to thoroughly understand themselves and understand their role within community. The second piece Dr. Thurman believed in was that, and I'm paraphrasing here, everyone, he believed in meaningful and creative shared experiences, that if these experiences are multiplied and sustained throughout a lifetime, they can remove any barrier between us, whether it be race, ethnicity, creed, denomination, etc. And as a caveat, I always like to add the word remove almost every barrier, because I do not personally believe in absolutes, and I do believe that there are some things that, we may have to wrestle with a little bit further. And so I want to make sure you all clarify and understand that, because that's a really important philosophy here for us in the Thurman Center. Today, we are here in front of you all to talk about this idea of a philosophical mentoring relationship. Howard Thurman came here in 1953. Dr. King was a student at Boston University from 1951 to 1955, but he actually left Boston University in 1954 to take over the pastoral duties at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Georgia. And so this is a particular thing that we wanted to highlight, because Thurman and King are often mentioned from the capacity of a mentor-mentee relationship, but we're going to explain a little bit further, but that relationship was a little bit unconventional, as you all are familiar with. And so I want to keep in mind the timeline again. Martin Luther King came to Boston University in 1951. He graduated in 1955, but left in 1954. Howard Thurman came to Boston University in 1953. And so just to put those different timelines in a perspective for you all as we set our intention. But as you all know, we've all read things from different authors, notable figures that we've been continuously inspired by. And some of these things have become the philosophical foundation for our own personal ideologies. And so we want to create some space here to discuss the ways that Howard Thurman actually influenced and charted out a path for some of the major ideology that King was the primary practitioner for. We also want to contextualize this information with some of the things that we're seeing in today's current society. I want to keep in mind that we are recording a few days after the events that happened at the Capitol, and so we will be remiss to not acknowledge those events a bit, and they have changed the course of our conversation a little bit. And that's important that we acknowledge those things, because we can't have this conversation in isolation without analyzing history and the current circumstances. Today, we're going to get through some questions that we have drafted to have a really insightful and productive conversation with two people who, in my own right, and they don't have to accept this, but in my mind, these two people are emerging Thurman scholars. And I want to attribute that label to them. I think they have worked hard to earn such a name. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes the word scholar does not mean one always has to be an academic or in the academy. I think we have people who I would call street scholars, who have knowledge that they have learned throughout their life and experience. That is embodied knowledge that I think is very important and should be honored. And so I would like to give this label, this title to these two. And I am by no means an authority to do such a thing, but that is how I feel about the work that they do and the knowledge that they possess. So it was really important to have this in context with the work that they're doing as young people growing in their professions or rerouting their professions and trying to figure out something different, more meaningful, more true to their purpose to make sure that their life is continuously alive. So without further ado, I'm going to get into our first question. I am going to ask Jessica to start to answer our first question for you both, but what was your first introduction to King's work? And I'll start with you, Jessica.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to take that on. I just want to say first, thanks to you. This program is really your brainchild. And thanks to the Thurman Center and the town of Brookline for the opportunity to talk about, I think, a relationship that isn't often explored in ways that can help us understand our role in social change and how we move forward. And so I really like your unique perspective on this topic. So to answer your question, I will say, starting with Dr. King, I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee. And so as a native Memphian, April 4th, 1968 is a date that you know. It's a date that you know very well, that you mark and honor. It's a day that you grieve as well. In some respects, I think Memphis is King's Jerusalem, right? He rides in the town with his final message, not knowing it, but it's his final message, and we are all sort of, left to pick up that message or that idea that he envisioned. So it's a date that I know, that I grieve, but also one that motivates me to envision and work for a better world, or the beloved community, as King would say. So I would say absolutely, I was raised with a responsibility to community as evidenced by King's life. I think that is something that happens, that shapes a lot of the African American community in Memphis. As far as Thurman, that's a little different. I didn't hear the name Howard Washington Thurman until I was in college. And it came through my mother, who stepped out of her career to go to seminary at Boston University School of Theology, and was reading a lot of Thurman, and would always say, I just love how at peace he was about who he was, about his God, and about the world. And she loved his, deep reflection and contemplation work. And when I had like college conundrums that I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with, she would respond to my existential questions with a Thurman meditation, to which I was very angered because I didn't want a circular philosophical argument. I wanted my mom's advice, but she wanted me to think and reflect on my life and think about, what's my true north? What are my responsibilities? And ultimately, what do I know is good and right? And so over time, I've developed a much more of an appreciation for Thurman, including through seminary, and do really hold deep reverence for his work, for his life. And his meditations are dear to me. So that's sort of how I've been introduced to their both of their work.
Thurman is often relegated to a mentor to King, and so I'm happy you expanded on your experience of both Dr. Thurman and Dr. King. Andrew, for you, how were you introduced? What was your first introduction to King's work, and how were you introduced to the life of Howard Thurman?
Thank you, Nick. It's great to be here. Thank you to the town of Brooklyn and to the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground. It's an honor to lift up the lives and work of Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr., especially in the year 2021. There's so much happening, and it's important for us to remember them as they were. It's very important. I don't know when I was first introduced to Martin Luther King Jr.'s work. I think it was more of like a natural thing. He was a huge part of the public domain. We had his books in our home growing up. And I would remember going to my grandmother's house. She lived right off Crenshaw Boulevard, excuse me, every January for MLK Day celebration. There was a big parade down Crenshaw, and we would sit there, we would cheer as people came by, as Crenshaw High School dance and that sort of thing. And as I got older, I just always paid attention to his written works. I've always been spiritual, and so his sermons kind of grasped me from an early age. So yeah, I cannot pinpoint an exact time, but I would say that throughout my entire life, I've been exposed to King. Howard Thurman, however, I was exposed to at Morehouse College. So many of you may know that Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. are both graduates of Morehouse College. And previous presidents, Hugh Gloucester and Benjamin Elijah Mays, have called Thurman and King some of the greatest sons of Morehouse. And so when you go there, you're indoctrinated into who they were, what they did, and that sort of thing. And in addition to that, I happen to study philosophy. And my advisor, his name is Kipton Jensen, and he was a Thurman scholar. And he used to host these sessions called Thurman Thursdays. And during Thurman Thursdays, we would listen to a meditation, sit in silence, and then reflect as a group. And that really resonated with me. And I recall going home one Christmas break and stopping by the bookstore before I left Atlanta and buying perhaps a dozen copies of Meditations of the Heart, one of Thurman's books of reflections and devotional work. And I gave that as gifts to family and friends. And from then, I've been a Thurman aficionado.
That's amazing. I honestly thought one of you would say, like, when I was in high school, I had to do a book report and I chose Martin Luther King. That's how it was for us in Chicago. Every Black History Month, you had to do a sort of history project. At a certain point, Martin Luther King was not an option anymore because everyone would choose him. Thank you all for sharing, such eloquent thoughts and eloquent experiences with both of them. We'll get into our next question. At Boston University, the relationship between Dr. King and Dr. Thurman is often mentioned as this traditional mentor-mentee relationship. According to written records and personal testimonies from people in both of their inner circles, they had very limited in-person interaction. Can you all expand on your understanding of King and Thurman's mentor-mentee relationship? And Jessica, we'll start with you again on this question as well.
Great question. As I mentioned, I learned about Thurman through my mother, and she did, in fact, introduce him to me as King's mentor, right? Because I'm in college, a little cynical. I'm like, what's so special about Howard Washington Thurman? So she says, well, she's giving me all of his accolades, right? That you ran down, Nick, for us. And then she says, and he's King's mentor. And I'm like, okay, now this is interesting. In my time studying from some of the most renowned, I think, Thurman scholars who were on faculty at the School of Theology, I have learned a little bit more about their relationship, and that, you're right, Nick, it's not that they had so many personal interactions, but that they were aware of one another. I think you even told me that they, attended a Red Sox game together once. I think one thing that really struck me that I hadn't realized that Andrew pointed out for us was the Morehouse Connection. So as I understand it from my reading, Thurman was a classmate of King's father, so King Sr., and so would visit the family from time to time when King Jr. was a child. And so he was in the midst of, had proximity to the conversations that those two were having. Um, and I would say that they, were representatives, students of Morehouse, et cetera, who I think Morehouse really represents a particular lens um, and leadership in Black social change, right? So I can imagine how those conversations would have been influential to King Jr. And so I've heard it said that it was more like, having an uncle come over to dinner, right? And so thinking about Jr. being young and hearing Thurman's ideas and his father's ideas and being greatly influenced by them and having that be his lens. I think that's something that's a piece of the pie or a part of the story that you don't often hear, but I think it's really important to note. Particularly when people say, what's the difference between Thurman and King? Know that Thurman was in King's atmosphere when King was a younger person. And so younger people, are watching, are listening, and what you do and say is incorporated into their worldview and their lens. So I think that's a really important aspect of their relationship. But I would say, Thurman's sermons drew people from all over to Marsh Chapel. There's lots of stories. If you just even scroll through any articles that you read about Thurman, you'll undoubtedly find someone that said, I once heard him on the radio at Marsh Chapel. I once saw him at Marsh Chapel. It was the thing to do to come to see Howard Thurman. His sermons were so powerful. And again, I've heard it said that King attended Marsh Chapel as well and listened intently to Thurman, took notes, and was very influenced by him and was reading Thurman. That's clear as well. And so I think their connection early on in King's life made it such that Thurman was someone that King would pay attention to in his work and would trust later in his life when Thurman visited him or wrote to him after an unfortunate incident in which led to him being hospitalized. King really took Thurman's advice to rest and to go deeper in to do his interior work, which Thurman recommended for everybody. For King to do his interior work, to really understand his why for the civil rights movement, and that sort of trust that they had, the reverence that King had for Thurman, and the advice, really we see sort of this King 2.0 show up after that, right? So I think those are some aspects of their relationship that are really important when we think about philosophical mentors. But I want to highlight the proximity that there was a relationship there as well, and trust that was built.
Yes, as Jessica mentioned, the influence was primarily philosophical, pastoral, intellectual, and spiritual. When you're part of the Black religious tradition, it's almost a duty to know who has come before you. And I think King did his homework. And also because of their family ties, they were also always kind of crossing paths in direct ways as well. I think it's important to mention that Dr. King, in his early public life, carried a book with him, one that Thurman wrote, and it's called Jesus and the Disinherited. And that book opens with the question, what does the religion of Jesus say to those with their backs against the wall? And it's very interesting to know that that helped sustain King and other leaders in the movement throughout their early days of marching and protesting and boycotting.
Yeah, I'm so happy that Jessica, you shared a perspective about proximity and how that looks different throughout a lifetime for people. Sharing Thurman's influence on King, being around as a family friend, right, as Uncle Howard, so to speak, is important to highlight how that can be a part of King's sort of youth development and as he grew up into to an adult. And thank you, Andrew, as well, for bringing up Jesus and the Disinherited. And for those who are unfamiliar, it's a book where Thurman is trying to speak to those who do not understand who Jesus was, as he's trying to outline for you what Jesus would say to those who are oppressed, right? Beyond just our understanding of Jesus as being the the figure and the religion of Christianity. So he's still acknowledging Christianity and acknowledging Jesus' place, but he's painting a different view of Jesus that isn't popularly painted for some folks. And he really is intentional about telling you what Jesus might say to someone who is dealing with oppression. And so I think that's really key to highlight. Thank you, Andrew, for bringing that up.
And just to add a little bit more, it's really interesting. To be Black and to be Christian is a complex thing, right? And so what Thurman was doing in that book was saying that we are not practitioners of the religion about Jesus. We are practitioners of the religion of Jesus. And those distinctions, even for me, helped reconcile my identity as a Black man in the 21st century and my faith as a Christian.
Absolutely. Can I jump in as well? One pivotal thing that Thurman does right out the gate is to interpret Jesus, to reinterpret Jesus. This was huge for me because in many Christian traditions, Paul is really deemed the first theologian, right? He is codifying almost Christ's agenda, right? And so Thurman says, well, that's one way to think about Jesus. I'm going to give you a different way to think about Jesus. And he situates Jesus, he identifies Jesus as a person with his back against the wall, right? And he situates him, contextualizes him in his socioeconomic condition in a highly occupied Roman Empire. And so it's from that you can draw a connection between that Jesus, interpreted differently than what we see in the mainstream, that Jesus and the Black community, particularly the African-American community, Black community in America. And so for me, this is really important. I think it's one of the strongest bases we have for Black liberation theology. People don't always say that. I see that connection. So I just want to highlight that Jesus and the Disinherited gives us a new way of understanding Jesus altogether.
And let's keep talking about that, Jessica, because, Black liberation theology gives lots of acclaim to James Cone, but Howard Thurman, to me, is the progenitor of Black liberation theology. He talks about Jesus as being a poor Palestinian Jew, which made him a minority in the ancient Near East. And when he was faced with hatred, deception, and fear, he combated that and overcame that with love. So those are just such ripe points, such ripe analysis of the Christian tradition. And also his grandmother, Nancy, who was a slave, right? Who reared Thurman. She also was a person of faith. And she knew that the slave masters would use the letters of Paul to sort of justify slavery, right? So her aversion to Paul's letters, I think, kind of rubbed off on Thurman, which is also a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I think she said that the ministers on the plantation that were Black and also slaves, they would preach sermons, but always end the sermon with this idea that you are not slaves, you are not niggers, you are God's people, you are children of God. So special.
Yeah. One more distinction here that I have to call out while we're on it.
Yes.
He continued with Paul. Not only does Thurman give us an interpretation of Jesus, right? He contextualizes Paul as well. He essentially identifies Paul as privileged. Paul was Jewish as well, but Paul paid his taxes, right? He was a wealthy, like part of the Jewish leadership, right, at one point. And so he was protected in the Roman Empire. If you paid your taxes, you were protected. And so he tells us when Paul says things, he's doing it from a place of privilege. What Jesus is doing is from a place of being someone who is marginalized, who is oppressed, who has their back against the wall. And having the distinction between the two, when you are enslaved and there are people who are telling you what you must do while you are enslaved and using Paul to support it, that distinction means a lot. Generationally, it means a lot.
I actually you all went here, so I have to push you even further. Can you help our audience understand why it would be so instrumental for Dr. King to carry this book along with him in his early public life. And if I recall, he carried Jesus and the Disinherited, a copy of the Bible as well in his early public life. And so could you all help our audience understand why some of the teachings in that book would connect to King in such a way and therefore influence King's actions within the greater movement?
I think using the example of Jesus in the face of all of these threats of non-being, right, is really central here. He uses love, not just some passive love, this touchy-feely thing, no, but love is speaking power to truth, right? Love is confronting the evil forces in the world, but not confronting them with violence or with hatred or meeting them with the same sort of animus that you've been met with. It's about going deep within to dignify oneself, but also dignify the person who's in opposition to you and your demands for simple things, equality, right? We're talking about, oh, and let's put this in the 21st century context, right? We're struggling now for equal pay, equal protection under the law, adequate housing, etc. And for those that oppose those sorts of human rights, and do it in such a way that degrades our humanity, right? I think for us as the oppressed, it becomes very easy to say, we must raise up in arms and do something not just radical, but something destructive, right? We want to tear down the systems that oppress us. And I think it's okay to tear those systems down, but to do it non-violently, I think, calls us to a higher level of humanity. And I think for King, that was central. And to also mention, Thurman and King both met Gandhi while Gandhi was under British rule. And Gandhi talked about nonviolence and ahimsa and that sort of thing. But Gandhi also believed that it was going to be the African American who brought nonviolence to bear in such a way that transforms society. And I think we see that with King. So carrying that book is carrying a toolbox that enabled him and others to truly do the work that we're still called to do today.
I love that. Yes, a toolbox for sure. And I think there's something that you said that was really powerful, Andrew, that I want to kind of get back to. When you were talking about destruction and violence, I think we need to broaden our definition of what is violent, right? There seems to be a double standard about what is violent these days. There seems to be a labeling of some people as violent while others are not, of some behaviors as violent without putting them in context to what was done before. And so violence, as Andrew said, is destructive. Destruction by any means. You can do violence with your words. You can do violence with action. You can do violence with policies, right? Public policies can be violent, in my opinion. And so it's really important to understand that this love ethic that we're talking about, when Thurman says in chapter 5, it's fundamentally of Jesus and the Disinherited, it's fundamentally about removing your opponent from enemy status, right? So Andrew said, oh, because we want to transform. Let me break down the transformation process here. The transformation process isn't about sort of eradicating bad systems, structures, violent systems and structures, and then moving to replace or switch the power dynamic, right? It's not so that you then leave the status of having your back against the wall and then you become powerful and you do it to somebody else. That's not what we're talking about. Thurman is talking about a fundamental shift in how we organize our lives, as I read it, which I love politics, so that's what I think of it. And so he's saying something differently. And I think for King to carry Jesus and the Disinherited with him at all times really speaks to the end goal of his work, right? And people are scared at this time, like, what is he doing, right? Right? People in the government are really nervous about what King is doing. His end goal isn't to switch the power dynamic such that people who are in power are now with their backs against the wall. King is talking about how we live together, honoring one another's inherent dignity and worth, not such that what you've done to me that I will do to you. That's not what I'm going to do. When he's talking about the beloved community, he's talking about fundamentally reframing this democracy project we have here in America, which is so important then, it's so important today.
Well, you all have taken us here, so I want to ask this follow-up question. Two philosophies that King and Thurman both shared were nonviolent protest as a technique of direct action for organizing, and this idea of a love ethic necessary for communities. Can you all expand on the significance of these philosophies in the greater fight for human rights and what they mean today? In terms of what are some direct examples that you all see in the world today? And I'll let Andrew lead on this one.
Thanks, Nick. That's a huge question. And I guess we have to move slowly, perhaps, through this to do it justice. So nonviolent direct action, from my point of view, is about struggling for justice and equity while respecting oneself and those in opposition to us, so to speak. This isn't an easy thing to do. If we look at the 60s and even 50s, there were trainings that were hosted throughout the South. People had to be equipped with resources for being spit on and being clubbed and being sprayed with powerful firefighter water hoses and that sort of thing, to not respond naturally, which in some instances could be, fight or flight, but the fight response. Yeah, it just takes training. I mean, and I'm stuttering because I laugh because I think about myself, and I think about myself in the 60s, right? And in this whole like struggle for our humanity. And I don't know if I mean, I want to say in good faith that I would have been nonviolent, would have been able to do the trainings, would have been able to be on the front lines and that sort of thing. But I just don't know. I don't know. And so, yes, so back to the question for Thurman, the search for common ground, for example, is about recognizing our interconnectedness, our interwovenness, and our interdependence. And for King, the beloved community, it's his way of almost framing the same sort of concept. Where do we see these two things manifest today? I think we see it in many places. I think the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground is a great place that kind of brings people together with diverse perspectives and encourages us to go deep, to speak truth, to not turn away when something is said that kind of makes us recoil. I think we encourage people to sort of lean in. I think that's the quote these days. How do we lean into the discussion? And I think that's a beautiful thing, especially for people in college to become for them to become accustomed to, let's put it that way. I also think that interfaith and interreligious and also interracial coalitions fighting to register voters in the South are doing this work. In addition, I would like to point out Reverend William Barber in North Carolina. His Moral Mondays movement, his Poor People's Campaign is a direct connection to King and the work, the unfinished work that he left behind. So yeah, these things manifest in many ways, big and small. I see it manifest in my own community in Roxbury. We do lots of great activism. It's funny, I live on the same street as Kim Janey, who was the city council president, but now is the mayor-elect of Boston because Marty Walsh has been called up by President Biden to become the labor secretary. And so, yes, these things manifest.
Yeah, I'll take the question a little bit of a different direction. Andrew's talking about, the nonviolent direct action trainings. I think a really key piece of that training that I actually would want to see more of in the world, Nick, so this is where I'm taking the question in a different direction, is how you train yourself not to react in the situations. Before that training is deep exploration of your interior, right? That's what you were talking about in that step one kind of common ground, Nick, is self-exploration. And so if we understand ourselves to be interconnected, for example, COVID-19 has shown us, I hope, how deeply interconnected we are, how our decisions, for example, to wear or not wear a mask, greatly impact not just your family, but your surrounding community. Um, and how your decisions generally with the policies you support or don't support truly affect and show up in the lives of others, right? So we're interconnected, but what helps us in that step 2 of common ground of finding these creative and shared and creative meaningful experiences is the fact that we've done our deep work. And you could see that come up in some of these debates around the mask. I think you all can probably imagine what I'm talking about here, but the deep connection of if I know who I am, if I know where my north is, if I know who my God is, if that is applicable to you, and I know what that means for the world, right? The ethic, right? My belief and my ethic, then here's what I'm going to do. Right? That's the same resolve I could imagine that comes up when eggs are being thrown at you when you try to sit at a lunch counter to integrate it, right? It's the same thing that comes up when hoses are turned on you, right? Or dogs are unleashed on you by the police. It's the same sort of I know who I am that is so important. And so what I love about what this pandemic has shown us, I think, I hope, is the importance of the interior such that you know it for yourself and you see it in and for others, that you value others the same way that you value yourself. Places like the Thurman Center, I agree, are doing this. We're starting to see a lot of these conversations even on the House floor, on Capitol Hill, right? People are pleading, right? And social media, right? People are pleading for everyone to understand sort of this greater goal of picture, again, of how we achieve the beloved community, how we live together. So I took it in a little bit of a different direction, but I hope that gives you some insight to my thoughts on this.
Thank you. And I want to mention, and this is something that Andrew alluded to earlier, that Thurman actually met Gandhi, I believe, in the 1940s. King doesn't encounter, I don't think King actually ever met Gandhi. I think he met Gandhi's, Gandhi's crew, so to speak, later in the 1950s. He didn't actually get a chance to directly meet with Gandhi, but this specific use for nonviolent protest as a technique for direct action is actually something that Thurman admired about what Gandhi was doing in India. And he thought to himself, even as he was analyzing it, how could this be used in America for oppressed people who are organizing to fight for their human rights? So even back then, Thurman had that ideology and those thoughts, and he was considering them in the 1940s after experiencing this with Gandhi. So I just thought that was really important to highlight. You all give such eloquent answers, and so we have to ask this question as well, because you all are just really immersed and thoroughly immersed in Thurman and King. Both King and Thurman attended seminary, respectively, right? King went to Crozer Theological Seminary, and Thurman attended Rochester Seminary. Both of you all worked in corporate environments prior to attending seminary, and then you all felt called to sort of make a pivot and to use a sports reference, to take your talents to South Beach, right? To take your talents elsewhere, and you decided to make a change. What quests were you embarking on when you decided to attend seminary after having seemingly successful careers? And how has your attendance in seminary helped you emerge into new ideas about love and community? And I will go to Andrew first, since he unmuted first.
Yeah, I can jump in. So for me, like, the idea of going to seminary never really crossed my mind. It was really about coming to the Boston University School of Theology, which I knew was coined the School of the Prophets. I knew through my philosophical studies and just overall reading that folks like Walter Mueller taught here, that Edgar Sheffield Brightman taught here, that Howard Thurman taught here, that Dr. King went here, that Jim Lawson went here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said to myself, I'm so keenly aware of these social problems in my day. Where can I go to find the language, the tools to sort of enact social change? And I thought this would be the best place to do that. And so I came here, I studied lots of ethical methods for doing social ethics. And it's equipped me well. It's equipped me well. What is ethics? Ethics is taking morality, right, but giving it a practical application, right? How do we promote social good and see it manifest in the lives of those who need it most, right? How do we not just pursue interests that serve us, but interests that serve the least of us? That's where I'm coming from when I think about my experience in seminary, and I'm so grateful for what I've learned. I'm happy to be sitting in the School of Theology right now in this Office of Development and Alumni Relations. There's a certain spirit and energy that I think resides in these halls and in these walls. And so every time I take a walk through the library or a walk through the first floor, or even the third floor where all of our professors' offices are, and where professors from previous generations' offices were, I'm moved, and I feel a sense of responsibility to carry forward the traditions that have been born here.
Yeah, so I did have I thought, successful career in public policy and advocacy, worked in healthcare policy and loved it. Like that will always be, I think, my first vocational love. But I got tired of doing the same old rigmarole of just like doing policy for the sake of doing and not doing policy to change who we are. And um, I needed to to really think about what tools and what skill set I would need to kind of change how we do policy. I actually really needed to get to my why. I'm deeply influenced by my faith. And so that meant that I needed to sort of go back to my faith to understand why it is I do what I do, what it is that I believe, and why it is that I do what I do. And so that led me to seminary. Again, I agree. This is not anything that I ever thought that I would. Seminary is not a place I thought I'd find myself in. I'll say that. Um, and and but when I decided to go, it felt so natural at the same time, like the natural next thing. And I'm grateful for my time, truly, of just so much reflection, so much contemplation on the work that I've done, but the world that I want to see us emerge into. And so, what theology, more of my focus, what theology is, what I take of it is that it's deep reflection on the human experience. I am actively involved in understanding the human condition. And I think that gives me a chance to reconcile what I believe and then what I do in light of those beliefs, and then to replicate that in the public square, right? To challenge people on what they believe and then what they do. And so I think it's critical to politics and public policy. I certainly hope to head back into public policy after graduation. Um, so theology is really crucial to that because it's about how we'll organize our lives together, in my opinion. And so it's really redefined for me and sharpened, I think, how I understand love, how I understand community, how I understand hope. These things that we say, but really sort of are theological constructions. So, for example, that love is creative really reminds me of our responsibility to constantly be creating something good, right? Not something destructive, because that would actually be hate. So, it's helped me think about these theological concepts differently and to spot barriers so that I can think differently about our solutions for the common good.
Thank you. I really appreciate you all offering those perspectives about your journey. So far, we've spent a lot of time discussing Thurman's influence on King's thinking, Are there other people that you all would like to highlight in relation to our theme, right? Other folks who may have influenced both of their thinkings. And I'll start with you, Andrew, and then I'll go to you, Jessica.
Yes, I mentioned Grandma Nancy, and because I talked about her a little bit already, I want to mention Rufus Jones, who's a Quaker mystic that Thurman studied under for 1 year. And his definition of mysticism really resonated with Thurman. And the definition was that mysticism is an immediate awareness of relation to God, right? So Thurman and his spiritual work is not so much priestly, it's much more shamanic. And by priestly, we mean just articulating the contents of the Christian faith. And by shamanic, we mean moving people toward an encounter with God. So yes, I'm ordained these days, and I really used that conception in my work on a day-to-day basis. How do I lead people toward an encounter with God? Which inevitably leads to what Jessica was saying. Once you kind of align your internal world with the good, right? That internal world must express itself without. And that's what leads to transformation, to true transformation. So yes, Rufus Jones.
Jessica, for you.
Yeah, so for me, you know, I'm, thanks in part to my social location, and I apologize here, I'm dodging the sun, everyone, I apologize. Thanks in part to my social location, I'm always interested in the role of women, and really feel a need to feel grateful to be involved in conversations around giants, but also want to interject things from my lens, right, as a Black woman. And so I've always been curious as to the role of women in the civil rights movement, and the narratives that are perpetrated that really exclude them, to be quite frank. And so I have just of personal interest and uh, my own quest to sort of understand that piece. And so I think it's really important to name the ways that King and Thurman were influenced by women. And so to start with Thurman, Andrew mentioned Thurman's grandmother, Nancy Ambrose, who was an enslaved person who really influenced Thurman's faith. But I saw an interview with him once that sort of said that she gave him sort of this spine that he had. To be bold and courageous in this world with his beliefs, right? He was also, deeply influenced by his mother, who, as I read his autobiography, may have been struggling with some sort of mental illness, right? And he's deep into his curiosity around her suffering and how she experiences the world. He kind of takes that on as I read his autobiography. He's deeply protective of his younger sister. They're very close. He marries his first love, Katie, and they are partners in changing the world, right? She's an active social worker. She is out in the community, contracts tuberculosis and dies, but he chooses he chooses a partner in his wife that really they are sort of focused. They have these same sort of ethical goals for the world, and I always found that to be interesting. His second wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, is undoubtedly another influence on him. She was amazing and doing activism and public service before she met Thurman, is involved in the Young Women's Christian Association, YWCA, traveling with them, leading their, at the time called Negro delegations. And so he's really influenced and I think trusting of women in a way that I don't see coming from men at his time. I know that's controversial to say, but it's just sort of what I see. And I think that's always been a really important thing to name about Thurman, and why I think I've sort of figured out why I like to engage with him, because he takes everyone seriously. It's not like I talk about taking everyone seriously, but these social barriers and labels that we have, you go over there, you go over there, you go over there. No, Thurman is like, everyone is taken seriously. And then I'll say he has two young daughters at the time that he's at BU. And so I think he sees the world through their eyes as well. So I just want to name the women that are influential to Thurman. And one more note about Bailey Thurman. I was reading in some of the archives when I was doing research. People wrote to Howard Thurman asking about Sue. Hey, Howard, hope you're well. Please tell Sue to call me. I need Sue, right? These are really influential people. Really influential people in the Black community, really influential people in government and higher education saying, I need to talk to Sue Bailey Thurman because there's nobody who can help me like Sue. I think that says a lot about him as well, that people would reach out and know that Thurman is who I come to for X, but Sue is who I need, right, for something else. That's important. I think sort of that's what I wanted to highlight on those pieces.
Thank you all for sharing that. And of course, I would be remiss if I not to add Coretta Scott King's influence on Dr. King. She attended the New England Conservatory, as you all familiar, and is a trained opera singer. What many folks don't know is that she actually used her opera career as a fundraising mechanism for some of the work that King did. And so that's extremely important to acknowledge, to also acknowledge how she was always sort of politically inclined and very well informed and engaged. And that played a significant role on influencing some of the work that King did in particular. And so it's important to note that, because she continued the work long after he left this earth, he transitioned beyond. So I just wanted to make sure that I add that anecdote as well, and add an anecdote about Sue Bailey Thurman, who I believe is the primary practitioner of everything that we hear for Howard Thurman and how special she was, and a giant in her own right. And when we mention Thurman meeting Gandhi, right by his side, right, not behind him, but right by his side, was Sue Bailey Thurman as well, on one of those Negro delegation trips that Jessica mentioned.
Yeah, can I add really quickly about Coretta Scott King? Yes, she continued her activism well after King's assassination, but she was involved in activism well before she met King, well before she was introduced to King. She was involved in the peace movements. She was involved in the struggle for human rights, labor rights. She was doing this work already. It was part of who she was prior to the conservatory. When she was a college student, she was out organizing and meeting with people and had goals for social transformation as well. And so I can't imagine she didn't have an influence on the work that he did, during their courtship and marriage, because it was something that was really important to her personally.
So this will be our last question, and we are speaking to the town of Brookline, which is adjacent to Boston, but shares some of the land that Boston University is on. Many pieces of the land that we have is in Brookline, and Brookline is an amazing partner to Boston University, very well connected and a part of some of the things the institution does. What advice, what message, what inspiration? As you all know, Thurman was always speaking to students. That was one of his primary audiences. And so he always wanted to inspire them to be motivated, to engage in the creative encounter with the divine, however one may define that. But he also wanted to inspire them to really think critically. And so we all have all heard stories of when he greeted students, he would always say, "Who are you? Who are you really?" And so to students, right, to high school, grade school, college age students, what advice, what words would you like to give to them based on your knowledge of both King and Thurman?
I can say a couple of things. I think for me, with Thurman's influence, it's to spend time in nature. Um, Life is alive. And I think that in silence, we can hear something deeper. I know social media is right at our fingertips, especially to the youth. Put down Instagram, put down TikTok. sit in silence, hear that still small voice within you and respond to what you're being called to. I think that's so very important. Another thing is to expose yourself to people who are unlike you, people who don't look like you, who don't smell like you, who don't think like you, uh, 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 who don't talk like you. There's something to learn. Um, there's something to learn in our, how do I say this? Through our particular experience, I think each of us holds the key to the eternal or universal, right? And I think the more people you come in contact with, the more keys you collect and the more windows you're able to see through, so to speak. Um, so yeah, meet as many people as you can. And I think one other thing is to perhaps never stand up for your own interest only. Always do your best to ask the quietest person in the room what they're thinking, um, because they too have something to say.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I'm thinking about a reflection that, or a meditation that my mother sent me a long time ago from Thurman, the decision to act. And in that meditation, and a lot of Thurman's writing, he talks about the energy that accompanies what you do, right? And so thinking about young people and the time that we're living in, I can't imagine they are not um, unaffected by what's going on in our world, as we continue to figure out how to live together, how to achieve community. The decision to act releases energy with it. And I want you to be very cognizant of what you're acting on, what you think and believe, and what energy is released with what you do. We said it earlier, love is creative. So your decision to act is creative. And I don't mean just artistically creative. I mean that when you do something that creates something, that creates something, that creates something else, life is alive, life is creative, life is constantly creating. And so when you act, it releases something. So I want to just share that as food for thought. What are you acting on? What are you creating? And then to support that, I want to share one of my favorite pieces of Thurman, something that I read in a class I took on Thurman with Dr. Walter Fluker. Was this piece on human freedom and the Emancipation Proclamation. My favorite piece, Nick already knows. It's a short piece, but every line is so intentional. It's so important. It's packed with such full information. But the piece that I want to leave you all with is his definition of freedom. Because I think as young people, you're probably hearing a lot of calls and cries for freedom. You're probably involved in them. And I want you to have this definition in mind. So Thurman gives two, but he says, freedom is the sense of alternatives or options. Freedom is the sense of alternatives or options. And then he goes on to say, freedom is the capacity to critically influence or determine the future by taking action in the present. So what did I say earlier? The decision to act releases creative energy, right? It's creating something. And freedom is already within, right? It's that sense of alternatives you have. It's that gut feeling when you see something isn't right and you know that it can be some other way. When you're watching the news, when you're on social media and you say, but what about when you take action in that, in our world, towards social transformation, it's your exercise of freedom. So I want to give you that as food for thought in our struggle for liberation, that you know that you are free, that deep interior work, the paying attention to what is inside of you. I agree with Andrew, get out in nature and get to know you and how big this world is. And when you take the time to act from that place, you are exercising your freedom. And so then the question becomes, what can we create and how can we liberate? That's sort of the question for the next step of the question for me. So I hope you'll take time to think about how you will exercise your freedom and act for the good of our world.
Radical love and freedom to all of you all in Brookline. Thank you all for viewing our program. If you are interested in more information on Howard Thurman, you can find it on our website here in the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground. And it's simple. You can find us at bu.edu/HTC or bu.edu/Thurman. You can also follow us anywhere but home. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, social media, all of those things. We are simply at BUHTC. I want to thank you again to Jessica Hamilton and Reverend Andrew Kimble for being here today with us and having this productive and thoughtful conversation on the philosophical mentoring and influence. Thank you again, Brookline, for offering us this opportunity. Thank you again, Bernard Green, and thank you again to Caitlin Starr, who are from the Brookline Office of Diversity and Inclusion, for extending this invitation to the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground as well. And I would be remiss not to thank Ms. Kennedy, our director here in the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground, and our Associate Provost and Dean of Students, Dean Kenneth Elmore. So thank you all again, and we're signing off, and we were happy to be here with you all.